I believe, because it's not a belief system. When you're living with the Shipibo, this stuff is real. It doesn't matter whether you believe it or not. This is how they experience the world. This is, to say you don't believe in it is just, that's insanity. That's ludicrous. It's almost like being in the Western world and saying, yeah, I don't really believe in gravity. I don't really believe in the atom.
Do you have an example of maybe something that if you said to yourself 11 years ago, you would be very dismissive of some spiritual or shamanistic idea that you believe now, where, you know, past you would have said that's ridiculous, you know, that's not science. Something where you've really changed your tone from being very science heavy to, okay, maybe there is a spiritualism, shamanistic side to this. You know, you mentioned at the start, during your bad experience, the demon experience, that you missed the protection smoke, right? You know, you highlighted that as an important point, and that would be maybe a point where the science hat is saying, well, come on, that's, you know, there's nothing to that. But then, you know, is that a perspective that you've shifted on? You know, I'm curious, like, really how your mindset has changed on this over your time, and especially going through the apprenticeship in the shamanism and everything. Like, do you have a really good example for people on something you've changed your mind on?
I mean, there are there are so many examples. I mean, I think one obvious one would be a shift more towards an animistic view of the world.
Okay.
So a lot of shamanism is based on the worldview of animism. And animism is the idea that everything has a spirit, everything has consciousness, like, if you will. That's one way of explaining it. And that means that when you engage with pretty much anything, you engage with it in a different way. So let me give you an example in terms of ayahuasca. So if you believe that ayahuasca, and your perception is that ayahuasca is in some way conscious, then when you drink ayahuasca, you're no longer thinking, there's just DMT binding to my serotonin receptors, monoamine oxidase inhibitors preventing its breakdown, within the stomach, etc., etc., etc. You're now thinking, okay, this is a spirit, and I treat it in the way that I would treat any kind of relationship. I want to get to know this spirit. I want to get to know this being and form a relationship with them. And so it means that for me, when I conduct research, I'm no longer conducting research on ayahuasca, as it were. I'm trying to conduct research with ayahuasca, almost as a co-researcher in that process. And that's something that I've been learning with the indigenous curanderos that I work with. And it's something that really asks you to change the way that you approach research, which is where the fun really starts.
And how does that change the trip itself? That sort of shift in psychological relationship with the substance, how does that manifest experientially once you take the ayahuasca?
I mean, for me personally, it's through communication and intention. And so you're no longer there kind of talking to yourself or watching the subconscious material kind of manifest in some way in front of your eyes, but instead you're asking things, you're speaking, you're in dialogue. It's an alive, open conversation, and you have to be willing to hear yes, and you have to be willing to hear no. It's quite difficult to describe. It's something akin to prayer. Again, prayer is an extremely loaded word, but I see similarities between the way that people engage with, Jesus Christ or God. This kind of a relationship where you're in dialogue, almost in constant dialogue, but it's just that now what you're in dialogue with, or who you're in dialogue with, is actually the subject of what you're researching. And so you start asking questions to ayahuasca as well.
Interesting. I've had a bunch of really fascinating guests and conversations now with different with people who have different perspectives on separating fact and fiction during a psychedelic trip. Like, what's a hallucination? What's real? What the hell does real even mean? So you ask Robin Carhart-Harris, you know, I know you've collaborated with in the past, one of the leading psychedelic researchers in the world, but by credential, and I just think he's just a great speaker and scientist overall. And he's like, you know, these are hallucinations. When people see entities, what they're sort of seeing is some sort of deep Jungian archetype that is like a shared culture of our subconscious. And I'm like, not totally satisfied with that answer, to be honest. I think he's incredible. I think every other answer he gave in my conversation, I was very satisfied with. That one, I didn't buy. And then you speak to Andrew Gallimore, who's done a bunch of research on DMT specifically and DMT entities. And he's like convinced that these entities are real, that these worlds are real. And again, it's very hard to define real, but he's like, the DMT maybe had some sort of ancestral neurobiology. And when we take DMT, we just kind of flip into this alternate world. Because why on earth would we seem to have this alternate setting that just kind of flips in and it's just this crazy other completely different world, but people that experience it say it's real? Like, why would the brain have this prediction hardware? And it does almost seem like a setting, like you're just switching it into that mode. And why would so many people have this shared hallucinations? Why would people see the same thing and have such similar reports of what they see if this psychedelic noise hypothesis was brought to its end? You know, if psychedelics is just incorporating noise into the brain prediction system, then you wouldn't really get that much shared trip reports, would you? Or maybe, at least in my mind, you wouldn't expect to see so much of the same stuff. I think maybe culture and shared culture is a partial explanation there, but I just don't think it goes the whole way. So how do you think about this, getting both the Western perspective, both the shamanistic perspective? Like, how do you separate fact from fiction in a hallucination, in an experience? Like, you must have a bunch of thoughts on this.
Yeah, totally. I mean, so it's interesting. So one of the first things that you have to learn when you're training in shamanism is, at least in Shipibo, is how to differentiate what is you and what is external. And they put a distinction on that. They say, you know, it's very different because it's very easy, and you see this. I see this so much with people drinking ayahuasca. You know, the ayahuasca told me to do this, or the mushrooms told me to do this, and half the time it's just something that the person clearly wants to do. So, for example, ayahuasca told me to buy a Tesla. It's like, bro, really? Like that? Do you think that could not just be like your own like desires kind of coming into the forefront? Right. And you see it all the time, and it's, you know, and some of the time, you know, it's quite funny. Other times it can be extremely serious, and it can lead to ego inflation and all of these serious things. But the Shipibo put a huge emphasis on how you distinguish, you know, what is ayahuasca and what is, you know, your own internal projection. So that's one of the first things. And there's really no way to tell someone how to do that. You have to experience it for yourself. You can look objectively and be like, okay, if ayahuasca is telling me to buy a Tesla, like, it's far more likely that that's going to be from my own mind than it's going to be from, you know, the spirit of ayahuasca. But it's really something that you kind of get used to experiencing when it seems to be, or when it's from an external source. So that's one of my thoughts. In terms of the reality, you know, of these worlds, I think reality is that's like a tricky word, and that's something that I would try and stay away from. I think, you know, the way that Andrew thinks about these things, from what I understand, is more akin actually to the way that indigenous communities describe these things, which is that, you know, entities, beings, spirits, whatever you want to call them, they're not just kind of, you know, here, just, you know, in the room with us necessarily, where you can say they're real or unreal. The Shipibo describe them literally existing within us, existing within our consciousness. And you can access them through ayahuasca, through altered states of consciousness, through dreams, through imagination. And that seems to be pretty uniform across shamanic traditions, across the world, and actually throughout the whole of time, which is quite reassuring from our understanding. And so those things, you know, Are they real? Yes. Are they in our head? Yes. Is it all consciousness? Yes. Is there, does it matter whether we perceive them to be in our head or we perceive them to be, kind of separate? I think we can get tangled in that and we can get stuck in that. So my understanding of it is that, yes, it is all in our head, but that doesn't make it any less real.
Yes. So how does that maybe provide a framework for thinking about your demon devil experience? Like how do you then contextualize that experience in what you just said there?
I mean, so my perception of that experience is that somebody sent some negative energy to me, which didn't exist outside of my consciousness, but it was external to me. And so when I was experiencing that attack, as I believe it to be, that was 100% real, and it wasn't me. It wasn't my subconscious that was creating that, but I was experiencing it within my own consciousness because somebody had sent that into my consciousness. Does that make sense?
No, but of course it does. I mean, the words where of course not, in a way, you know what I mean? Like but also I know what you mean, and yes, but also of course no, because I think it would be one of those things that I would have to have experienced and have to go through for me to be able to even remotely say yes. And then even if I was saying yes, I still wouldn't know if that's what happened to you. So does this sort of does play into sort of a idealist panpsychism idea? So like there is some sense that people can transfer consciousness between entities through, say, non-physical mediums that we would usually think about. Like obviously I can transfer something to you by speech. There's pure mechanistic neuroscience materialist explanations for that, but you would say that what happened there was sort of a non-material, non-physical transfer of consciousness.
Yes, absolutely. That's the way that I think of it now. And interesting that you bring up panpsychism, because I think that panpsychism is actually another one of the best explanations that we have for these kinds of things, these kinds of experiences. And it's interesting because one of the issues that I find in trying to bridge the gap between Western science and indigenous science is that we don't have the frameworks in Western science to be able to understand what indigenous peoples are talking about a lot of the time. We don't have the language to be able to describe it. But I think that metaphysics is one of the closest things that we have that can help us to understand these concepts. And panpsychism, I think, is pretty similar to what the Shipibo believe. But again, I'm even reluctant to say what the Shipibo believe because it's not a belief system. When you're living with the Shipibo, this stuff is real. It doesn't matter whether you believe it or not. This is how they experience the world. This is, to say you don't believe in it is just, that's insanity. That's ludicrous. It's almost like being in the Western world and saying, yeah, I don't really believe in gravity. I don't really believe in the atom. It's like, but that's just how we experience the world. It's not a case of whether you believe or don't believe in it.
Yes. And do you think there is a possible scientific explanation for what you just said? And when I say scientific, I don't mean materialist or physicalist. I mean like a science that we haven't discovered yet, that we don't understand, that is maybe even looks quite different to the science, quote unquote, that we have now. Because I know people that are trying to tackle panpsychism from a rigorous angle, very smart philosophers that are looking at these metaphysical positions and saying, well, maybe they are actually a better way to think about or to explain what we experience every day. Because clearly physicalism and materialism are extremely limited and not the whole picture. I believe that now as well. I started episode 1 of the podcast, pretty diehard materialism, coming from a neuroscience background, and now I learned the label biopsychist, which is sort of what I identify at the moment, that I think all biological life has consciousness, has some form of experience, has an experience of what it is like to be that thing in some minuscule amount. I've lost my train of thought now, but
it's all right. I'll help you out. I think, in answer to the first part of your question, I think that there will be a scientific explanation
That's what I was going,
for everything. Yeah, for everything that we experience, and I ultimately think that science and shamanism are looking at the same thing. And I think that, but we're looking at different perspectives. We're coming at a different angle from it. And I do feel that if we get there in terms of humanity, eventually we will come to the point where we have an explanation for these things that people experience. So, for example, kind of like what Andrew Gallimore refers to, kind of entities existing in these different dimensions. I think that there will be scientific explanations saying, yes, and we now know that dimension is, mathematically it is here, and that's something from that dimension. I do think that will eventually happen. But at the moment, obviously, because those two disciplines are so far apart, they both look ludicrous to each other. Like they both look like insanity to each other.
The Giant Shoulder mission is to explore radical ideas in biology, neuroscience, and consciousness, and elevate those stories to the highest possible level while keeping them accessible to everyone. If this interests you and you want to support independent science, then please consider subscribing to the Clips channel